Hey, welcome everybody. Glad to have you along this morning. John King, our wonderful show producer over there. How you doing, sir?
I'm doing great, Peter. Not as good and as dapper as you, though. You got a button-up shirt. He's classy.
I was expecting our guest. He probably can't see me on the phone, but I am wearing, for the first time in many years, Milt Datsopoulos, an actual button-down shirt.
That's right. Peter is in executive mode today.
We welcome Milt Datsopoulos to talk back for the first time. Milt, thanks for joining us this morning.
Well, I appreciate the invitation to be on the program, and I'm happy to be available.
And I know one thing's for sure, he's dressed more nicely than we are. So, all right, but go ahead, John.
Yeah, I wanted to give the public an opportunity. Milt wanted to come on and answer questions and be responsive to the public concerning the recent political practices suit involving his law firm and the T.J. McDermott campaign. So if you have questions or thoughts on the issue that you want to run by Milt, please give us a call. The phone number is 721-1290. I guess I'll get the ball rolling by asking Mr. Datsopoulos how he felt about the decision and how he plans to work with the commissioner's requests.
I appreciate the question. I think it's an important question. First of all, I think that the enforcement of political practice requirements and established criteria is important for all of us. I think one of the concerns that I have and a lot of people I have spoken to and that both sides of the aisle politically have is, where are we going politically in terms of contributions, in terms of disclosure, and how can we ensure transparency? A lot of this concern has generated out of that case that occurred in the United States Supreme Court called Citizens United that opened up contributions virtually for unlimited funds by corporations and very wealthy people. So I endorse pure transparency. People that get involved in political campaigns and supporting the candidates, I think they need to be enthusiastic about disclosing who they are and not hide behind any kind of special structure like a PAC that doesn't need to disclose who its contributors are. So any questions relating to Mr. McDermott, I think probably are related to that overall issue, and my view is people need to know who's involved in politics, what their involvement is, and what interests they may have personally in that involvement.
Now, Milt, I think one question that I had was that the very fact that this suit was filed and the judgment came out in favor of Mr. Clark and his complaint, did that take you by surprise? Because I know that your law firm has been very active in politics for many years, as well as other community interests. And the fact that this particular instance seemed to run afoul of the Political Practices Commission and the decision thereof, did it take you by surprise?
It took me by surprise in two ways, really. One, some of the reporting that we did was inaccurate. From my standpoint, that's disappointing. That shouldn't happen. We should know better, and if we don't, we should have taken the time to find out what the requirements are. What happens, especially under Mr. Model, who's a relative new commissioner, he's come in with a much more aggressive approach. I don't fault him for that. I think he's got the legislative authority to do that, and I think ultimately it's good for the political system that they have somebody that holds people accountable, all people. Secondly, I think for us to have made some of the mistakes we made is something that I need to apologize for, even though I don't make a lot of the paper disclosures. It's my responsibility to see they're made personally, and the one thing that is important for me to emphasize is that there was no intent in any way to deceive or to fail to disclose, but we did certain things that were technically wrong. For instance, we sent out some invitations to people, and they happened to be sent out on cards that had our firm initials on it. That clearly is wrong under the law. That clearly is a mistake. And there are certain other questions that we're puzzled by. For instance, we've been faulted because some of T.J. McDermott's supporters asked if they could use our phones. In the past, we've allowed candidates of both parties to use our phones after office hours, and they call supporters and encourage them to go to the election site, participate, and make sure the vote. And that apparently is a disclosure that should be disclosed because it carries some value. The confusing part is what is the value? You know, it's costing us nothing. Done during off times, that we've done it previously for many years for both the Republican candidates and the Democratic candidates. So those questions we need to sit down and discuss with the commissioner and see what his expectations are and figure out how we do that. For instance, how do you value that when you let, say, 5 people from the McDermott organization come up to your office at 6 o'clock and get on the phone and call people for an hour or two?
Hey, Milt, we're up against a break, so let's continue this discussion. We're going to take a quick break. Go ahead, John.
Oh, yeah, when we get back, you've already come clean, said that mistakes were made, but I wanted to get down to brass tacks as to why the mistakes were made. The commissioner, Jonathan Modell, said that it was because of a culture in Missoula. I wanted to see if you had the same opinion.
This is the Thursday edition of Talkback. Thanks for joining us this morning. And John King, I'm Peter Christian. Joining us on the telephone is noted Missoula attorney Milt Datsopoulos. We're in the middle of discussing the decision that came out against the McDermott campaign, of course, which also included the law firm of Datsopoulos, McDonald, and Lind from the Political Practices Commissioner. You asked a question, John.
Yeah, that's right. Jonathan Modell, when he was on our show last week, specifically talked about your company there, or the attorneys there. And he said that that Datsopoulos, McDonald, and Lind frequently deals with political practices issues in the state of Montana. And he said that the only reason he can think of why they would have been thinking that what they were doing was okay is because of a culture that exists in Missoula that may be different from elsewhere in Montana that allows that kind of thinking. And I wanted to get your take on that.
Well, I disagree with him. I think we have been involved in participation in the political system. I personally, for over 40 years, have done it virtually in every election cycle. I've supported Democrats to a larger extent, but I've also supported Republicans. I've gotten on TV and actively supported, for instance, a couple senatorial campaigns like Senator Burns. I look at myself philosophically more as a Democrat than a Republican. But the important thing is the culture of Missoula, a culture that is more toxic politically than other areas of Montana. My position is that the opposite is true. I think Missoula is an extraordinarily active place with people in every segment participating in every area of public interest. In fact, the rest of the state blames us for being political activists. I find that to be of a real benefit to the community. I don't think the activism that occurs has created this. I think that there is legitimate confusion. What is the requirement? For instance, our violations, shouldn't have more lawyers. We are more than lawyers. We have actively participated in the political process. This was a party that was well publicized. I personally sent out invitations or had invitations sent out, made phone calls, so obviously we weren't involved in trying to do anything secretive or deceptive, but we ran against violations of some rules. I guess you could argue that's one of the problems with government today. There's so many rules that really nobody knows exactly what they are.
Well, now, Milt, I think, if I may, I don't want to put words in Commissioner Modell's mouth, but the sense that I got was that he thinks that things that happen over here, if you'll forgive the term, are a little bit loosey-goosey. It's like, we're just kind of rolling with the flow. Yeah, we're going to have this party, and we're going to have, we're going to send out some invitations, and everything's cool. Everybody does it. Now, do you see it that way, or do you see it as because Mr. Modell seems to think it should be structured? There are certain rules that need to be followed. Every I needs to be dotted, every T needs to be crossed, that sort of thing.
I think part of what Mr. Modell says is right. I think most people that get involved in supporting political candidates, it's done more often. More people participate in Missoula. I think they generally understand that they're supposed to disclose any contributions they receive, disclose contributions they make, and I don't think most of us sit down and carefully understand what those requirements are. Those requirements, in terms of how the current legislation requires that we make those disclosures, they change. Mr. Modell has been more aggressive. I think he's been more detailed in his requirements. Clearly got the legal right to do that. But there's also going to be balance where you can't make it so difficult and so detailed and technical that unless you got a full-time political compliance officer, you can't and are concerned about getting involved in it. But the requirement to understand what your obligation is clearly a requirement that we didn't comply with. And our intention is to comply, and our intention is actually go sit down with Mr. Modell and say, okay, what are the rules of the game today? Clearly tell us, and we'll make sure we do them.
Sure. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, back to my original question as to why. It sounds like I've got two responses from you. One is that the law was too complicated, and another was that that you didn't know some of the law. And I wanted to know if it's kind of both. Do you think that we need to rewrite some of our political practices laws to make them more easy to abide by?
Now, we're going to take a little break, come right back and talk about that. Again, we have two lines open. Milt Datsopoulos, kind enough to join us this morning. Very busy law office, and we will continue with Talkback in a moment. And we're back on Talkback. 721-1290 is our number, and some of the most interesting things we talk about actually happen when we're during a commercial break. But John, you and Milt were talking about basically how this whole thing is going to go, how it's going to turn out.
Well, right before the break, I asked, is the law too confusing? Did you not know about it? And during the break, Milt was kind of talking about how he believes that the law has developed different than it has been in the past under Commissioner Modell. Can you go into your explanation of that?
Yes, I think that he's developing a regulatory framework that's more precise. It requires more, and it's caught a lot of people by surprise, including us. And it happens because here in Montana, most of us don't have what we call a formal political practice compliance officer, somebody in an organization that's required to be the careful evaluator of the criteria.
If you will, the political
right, or have we not?
If you will, the political sheriff of the firm, to use a pun.
I think he is a new type of political sheriff in Montana. I think he feels that Montana maybe generally has been loosey-goosey. I think people that get involved in this kind of activity, nobody wants to violate the law. People get confused that there are so many reporting requirements, and maybe that's just a part of the evolutionary process and that we're all catching up. The fact that a firm like ours ends up unintentionally violating some of the technical requirements indicates to me that a lot of participants surely aren't aware of the precise, extensive reporting requirements, and also the interpretation of some subtle factors, like if you lend 4 of your phones after hours to a political candidate and he uses them to call people that he wants out helping him, that's a contribution, and that you've got to disclose that. I have done this for 40 years. That expectation really surprised me, and personally I'm confused as how do you value that? There's no cost to our firm, and how do we disclose that and put a dollar number to it? These are the things I think probably should be expanded in Montana, and there should be some educational seminars around the state, people invited. If you're going to be involved in a political process, you need to come in and become educated about it. I think that hasn't occurred in the past.
Go ahead, John.
Oh, it seems to me that you work for a law firm that's dealt with political practices cases before, and I can understand how Jonathan Modell would see it, as an example of someone that should know the law. But there's lots of other corporations around Montana that are far from political practices activity most of the time, that probably have phone banks that they might loan out to a political campaign.
Like real estate offices, things like that. Yeah.
Exactly. And it seems to me the onus needs to be on the politicians. And they should be educated with a pamphlet or something about the laws that are coming up. But my question for you as a corporation, will this have a chilling effect on your participation in political campaigns going forward?
I think it clearly could have a chilling effect on people participating in politics by going to the trouble of an expense of creating a event where they have to go out and do a lot of work, take a lot of time, and more importantly, take the trouble and the unpleasant task of calling people up and saying, I want you to come over to my house or my office. I've got a candidate that's important. We need to get him elected. You need to participate. It's in your interest. I think you get caught in some of these technical violations and you read about yourself violating the law. It's got a chilling effect. There's no question, and that's one concern I have about being overly enthusiastic about some of these factors. And if that's what your expectation is as commissioner, then you have a much higher obligation to get that information to the people that are going to participate. And I think that's a process that hasn't been done and needs to be done. In terms of my participation, it's not going to chill or discourage me. I think it's a unfortunate situation that we ended up, just by lack of understanding what the expectations were and making some mistakes. We're obviously going to change our methods. We didn't have a strict organizational structure to see that every event that we sponsored or participated in, that we knew all the rules and complied. We thought generally we knew what the requirements were, and we were interested in complying, and there were people in the firm that filed the paperwork that we thought was necessary. It wasn't me, it wasn't Dennis Lind, and it was maybe one or two people. We now have to be more careful and coordinate one of the people in the firm who has the responsibility of being an expert on what the requirements are, and then they being held accountable to comply with those requirements.
Hang on just a second, Milt. Go ahead, John. We're up against the break.
Up against a break. It seems to me that you've said two things about Mr. Modal's reading of the law. One is that he is being more precise and upholding the letter of the law, and you've also said that he's added new things to the law. So I want to ask, do you believe he's properly reading the law, or has he expanded it beyond its original intent? Right before the break, I had asked Milt if he felt that Jonathan Modal's interpretation of the political practices laws at play here were a proper reading of the law, more precise, as he has said, or if they were new, as he has also said, an expansion of the law that wasn't the original intent of those laws.
And do you want me to comment on that?
Yeah, which side of that line do you believe it falls on? Is he upholding the law as it's written, or is he expanding it beyond its original intent?
Being a bit nitpicky-ish, maybe.
I think both parts of that question are involved in the confusion that has occurred, that has created problems for people trying to comply with making contributions and making sure they're legitimate, especially people that put on these political functions supporting candidates and trying to raise money. The issue here is, I think, under the legislation of Montana, is what we call enabling legislation. The Office of the Commissioner of Political Practices has been created by the legislature. The legislature has, in a broad manner, created that office and designated the selected commissioner, who's selected by the governor, to implement the law. Under the current law, the commissioner has taken the position that he's got a lot of discretion to determine what those requirements are going to be. And he could very well have that discretion, but what has been happening is Mr. Modal has expanded the requirements or refined them to the degree where they're more complicated, that most of us have not been aware of what the expectations are now. I think there's two sides to that problem. One is we should have made sure we knew what the new rules of the game are, and I think the Commissioner's Office needs to have a better system of educating people as to what his expectations are and why those expectations are legally enforceable.
Okay, tell you what, let's get to the phones and say good morning to TJ. TJ, you're on with Milt Datsopoulos. Go ahead.
Yes, one of the things I wanted to comment on was I went on political practices and I actually printed out what's called the Green Book, Accounting and Reporting Manual. And on page 13, it clearly states illegal contributions, corporate contributions. It's pretty easy to read. It's pretty easy to understand.
I can't hear.
Oh, hold on just a minute. Let me do this. Okay, TJ, would you make your point again, please? Try it again.
Yeah, so I went on political practices and I printed out what's called the Green Book, Accounting and Reporting Manual for Candidates and Campaign Treasurers. On page 13 of this book, it clearly states in bold, illegal contributions, corporate contributions. It's clearly readable, legible. If a corporate check is deposited inadvertently, a refund must be made immediately on discovery. Most candidates and large corporations know this. That's what's clearly stated in this. The other thing I wanted to say is I asked if there was any classes. Sure enough, on January 21st, they came and did a campaign school here in Missoula so candidates can go and learn. I just think that's kind of interesting that this book is too hard to understand.
Well, it's interesting. That's it. You would say that, TJ, because this little class is something I never heard of.
Well, TJ, what do you think about Mr. Datsopoulos' point about the phone bank and the difficulty of assessing the value of that?
Yeah.
Is there a line item on goods and services like that?
I believe there is. One of the things you can do is you could probably, it's maybe one of those things where everyone could bring their own cell phones and sit and use the office space, maybe have to rent that office space from them, but probably if they use their own cell phones. But that's one thing that you can call political practices and ask. You can ask. All those folks at political practices, Mr. Model, everything has, I'm sure they can, if you ask them a question, they'll tell you what's right and what's not right.
Actually, there's a disclaimer when you call, and I call very frequently.
Yes.
They say that whatever they tell you isn't legally binding. It's just advice.
Right. But wouldn't it be better to call and make sure that you're all on the up and up?
Okay, I'll tell you what.
I don't disagree.
We will let Milt answer your questions. Thanks for calling, TJ. So how do you respond to what TJ said there, Milt?
Well, I'm glad she brought it up. I do think that, one, she mentions there's a book that talks about the requirement. At some point, the requirement can become burdensome, especially if you're an individual or a couple of individuals that want to have a bunch of friends over to introduce the candidate and talk about contributions. I think probably almost none of those people are aware that they should call, and I'm sure none of them were aware that there were these campaign educational seminars. I think we've got to have campaign practice requirements. They need to be focused on disclosure, transparency, but they also need to be practical so that people look at them and say, wow, I'm not going to deal with this. That's pretty crazy stuff. I'm going to have to get a political practice lawyer to tell me what to do here. So I think you got to balance those two things, or you're going to diminish people's interest in getting involved and doing what they hopefully will continue to do, and that is expand their involvement in politics. Today, most people feel alienated by the political process, so they just quit participating. And the minority, and in many occasions, the very, very small minority ends up controlling the process, and we end up having total political gridlock because of it.
On the telephone this morning with Milt Datsopoulos, attorney, of course, the head guy at Datsopoulos, McDonald, and Lind. And let's get back to the phone and say good morning to Paul. Paul, you're on with Milt Datsopoulos. Go ahead.
Thanks. I'd like the last comment you made as far as alienation is in a small minority running the community. That
I can't hear the last portion of that statement.
I liked your comment about the alienation of people in a community, because I think that's happened here in Missoula. But just one comment: Mr. Model, I think, is very, very familiar with the Missoula culture. I think when he was appointed, he was here, And then as far as the legal status goes, and I ran for office for city council here, and I read some of the things. It's not that complicated, especially when it comes to money. And what bothers me is that this seems that almost a distraction. It's like your firm is dealing with the water company purchase, and your firm dealt with the state. I believe it had something to the state, but it doesn't matter because the same sort of things. It's like you say the law is developing. To me, it's the law is being corrupted. And
Corrupted by whom, Paul?
You think Mr. Model is corrupting the law, Paul?
I'm saying that in the stadium purchase, and I've written out you a letter, and city council members a letter, is that when the stadium was purchased, the urban
You're talking about the
renewal
baseball
district
stadium, right?
The baseball stadium,
Yeah.
the Osprey Stadium.
Is this? Are you asking a question for Mr. Datsopoulos?
Well, when he says the law is developing, there's developing the law and misconstruing its meaning and calling that developing. Those are different things. But as far as this issue goes, the candidate issue is that to say that you don't understand the law and you're a lawyer who deals with the law all the time, I can't see going into any trial with any defendants and saying, well, it's too complicated for me to understand. It's not my fault.
All right, thanks, Paul. So, Milt, how do you respond to that?
Well, that is concerns justified. I think we cannot make the requirements so burdensome that people, individuals, not corporations or even law firms like mine that have the resources and are willing to put the resources in it. People have to simply be able to understand, what can I do if I want to help somebody, and can I do it quickly and simply and inexpensively? If it gets much beyond that, people are just going to say, I'm out of here. The last thing I need is create problems for myself. This thing is a bureaucratic nightmare.
Now, Milt, you and I had spoken during the break about how this is similar, at least it struck me as being similar. The University of Montana has an entire staff of folks, and all they do all day long is monitor NCAA regulations to make sure that student athletes and their parents and families and everybody in the world abides by these, this huge handbook of NCAA guidelines. Does it sound a bit like that to you, the way it's becoming now with the political practices?
I think it's trending towards that direction, and especially in states that are like Montana, where we still don't operate at the level where most of the participants are either wealthy individuals or large, sophisticated corporations, but just regular folks still participate in politics. I think that if you keep adding more and more requirements and more subtleties to what the compliance is going to be, I think you're going to chase those people out of the political process. That's a disastrous potential consequence. One of the issues you and I talked about is the fact that the University of Montana was found to be in violation of certain NCAA rules because football players that were on red shirt, which means they weren't participating formally in the program, they were taking a year off because they were hurt or because they needed to get stronger or bigger, would go to the tailgate parties, and some of their friends, or particularly the parents of their friends on the football team, would have these tailgate parties, and they'd walk over and have a couple hot dogs and some chips and beverages, and that's a violation. That's
right.
Providing them with an unacceptable benefit. I hear something like this, and it, quite frankly, tells me government's getting out of hand here.
I hear you. So let's get back to the phones, and let's get Steve on the line. Steve, you are on with Milt Datsopoulos, and please speak good and loud. Go ahead.
Hello. I don't have really a question. It's just a comment. Luckily, I've only had to hire a lawyer one time in my life, and I darn sure know that he knew how to charge for phone calls. So, I mean, for him to sit there and say that he don't know how much to charge for phones, they know how to do it. Thanks.
All right, Steve. So what do you think about that, Milt?
Well, I think that's true. I think most lawyers charge for phone calls. What my comment is, I don't think I know what to charge for somebody that I'm allowing to use my phone to make phone calls not related to my practice or business, but related to the campaign. What's that value? And how's that determined? It may be a legitimate requirement of disclosure, but I think these are the kind of things that need to be expanded. There probably needs to be a really simple, direct handbook that guides you. If you're going to help somebody in his campaign and have a fundraiser, here are the 10 things you really have to pay attention to.
Right. Hold on. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you. You've spoken about the nature of these laws and Modal's reading of the laws and lack of knowledge of the laws. But now that you know what the law is, do you believe Montana's political practices laws are too burdensome for corporations?
We'll answer that when we come back from our break. Also, Sue and John are waiting, and we'll try to get those folks in. We'll have that question for Milt Datsopoulos when we come back. We're back on Talkback, 721-1290. Our time is short, so we want to get right back on the phone with Milt Datsopoulos. Now, John, would you repeat your question real quick?
I wanted to ask Mr. Datsopoulos if he believes, now that he understands the law, after having read this review from Mr. Modal, do you believe that the law as it's currently interpreted in the state of Montana, do you believe it's too burdensome for corporations to abide by?
I think some of it's too burdensome for individuals to comply with. I don't think corporations, it's too burdensome for them because they pay people to be in that business of compliance. A lot of them have lobbyists. The ones that do it seriously and spend a lot of money, I don't think that's a problem at all. I think they need to be held strictly accountable. I think small participants in the political process need to comply with disclosure, but that disclosure should be in a much more simple and understandable manner.
Okay, let's get back to the phone and say good morning to Sue. Sue, good morning. You're on Talkback. Go ahead.
Sue, are you there?
Stand by. Hold on just a second. I pushed the wrong button, actually. We got that. And so, Sue, you're on Talkback. Go ahead with Milt Datsopoulos. Hi.
Good morning, Milt.
How are you?
I'm good. So, I don't understand. I've been going to law offices and real estate offices and insurance offices for years after hours making calls to political candidates, and I don't know, am I missing something? But I thought that was okay.
Well, we thought it was okay also, and we've been actively involved in supporting political candidates and just general political causes, and utilizing our offices for meetings for folks on both sides of the political aisle that want to meet and discuss strategy or functions that they're going to organize. We've allowed people and candidates on both sides to come up and use our phones and call people they want to be supported. And quite frankly, I didn't feel that that was something that you needed to disclose and put a value on. And if that is the case, I think that changes things, and that, quite frankly, I don't know what you're supposed to do to comply with that.
Yeah, we're coming up on the end of our time together. I want to get one more call in. Charlie, you are on with Milt Datsopoulos. Go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, Milt.
Charlie, how are you?
Good, my friend. Well, I have a general comment. First of all, I've been in politics for nearly 50 years, run both Democrat and Republican races in Montana, and I think this has sent a shockwave, not through Missoula, but through Montana on the phone banks. No one really has ever said anything like this in Montana. And I can tell you there have been phone banks canceled in Democratic areas and Republican areas, independent areas, all over Montana. And I think it's very important, as Milt said, to be able to understand what these laws are.
Hey, Charlie, I'm gonna have to cut you off there and give Milt the last word because we have like a minute left. So Milt, could you respond to what Charlie said?
I support A.J. McDermott, and that's why I'm frustrated, because the dialogue is involved the nuances of political campaign laws and the issue of who the candidate should be to come in and reform the sheriff's office has gotten lost in the process.
I understand. Hey, Milt, thank you so much for your time. We deeply appreciate it. We look forward to talking with you again, sir.
Thanks, and I appreciate the opportunity. It's actually an interesting subject, and it's much more complex than just writing some rules in terms of making sure that people feel comfortable enough to keep participating.
All right. Thank you, Milt. Hey, take care, sir.